Welcome to eMpulse Podcast with your host, Dr. Julia Magana. I am an AI voice. Today we are going to be talking about artificial intelligence again and how it can be used in the ED. Don't worry, your job is safe. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to eMpulse. In the last episode, we dove into the waters of artificial intelligence with Dr. Peter Steele. He introduced us to artificial intelligence, or AI. AI is the simulation of human intelligence by machines, enabling them to perform tasks like learning, problem solving, and understanding language. It involves algorithms and models that can analyze data, recognize patterns, and make decisions or predictions without direct human intervention. He gave us several examples of how that can apply in emergency medicine. We can use AI to assist in tasks such as diagnosis, treatment planning, note writing, and patient monitoring. AI can analyze large volumes of medical data, including images and patient records, to provide insights, improve accuracy, and streamline healthcare processes. And it can even help us in research. Today, we're going to look a little closer at one of the more practical ways AI can impact us tomorrow on a shift: clinical decision support. To do that, I am joined by Dr. Gabriel Wardi, Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of California, San Diego. He is Chief of the Division of Critical Care within the Department of Emergency Medicine. Welcome, Gabe.
Thank you so much for the invitation here.
So, Gabe, clinical decision support is built to help us with diagnostic uncertainty, but we have all probably tried to apply a score or an algorithm that just doesn't fit the patient in front of us. The patient's data does not quite fit, and we get false alarms that create more noise. We either end up frustrated and give up, or even worse, the patient can end up at the wrong end of an algorithm that was not built for them. In your experience, what are some other pitfalls to traditional clinical decision support?
Yeah, well, I think like anything we use in medicine, clinical decision support can be a valuable tool. But you're exactly right. When the tool that we're using is not helping us provide better care, it's inherently problematic. So what are some of the common ones that I see? I'll start with ones that I see that are actually quite useful. What are things that I tend to forget in the emergency department that might result in patient harm? Well, one that I like a lot, we have at UCSD, is we have a clinical decision support tool that reminds me of when someone takes immunotherapy. I don't look through these medications, and I don't know half of them, but I get a notification. I think that adds a lot of value to what I'm doing. Another common one that I am a big fan of is one that reminds me that someone just checked a thyroid stimulating hormone in the last week, and it's probably not needed at that point. So those would be some good examples. Where do I see when we get in trouble, though? I think when there's going to be, specific groups in the hospital that have an agenda, and it might be a very well-meaning agenda, but it's implemented and it doesn't obtain the desired effect in the emergency department that we're taking a look at. And from that specific little group, when they try to put something there that doesn't fit within our workflow and doesn't add value to what we're doing, is when people tend to get frustrated with clinical decision support. So what might this look like? Well, it might be that we are reminding people that we don't need to give blood in specific situations, but we oftentimes know in the emergency department that if someone is bleeding out, it doesn't matter what their last hemoglobin is, we're going to want to transfuse blood. And that asking them to stop and think about what they're doing and click through 3 different boxes to push them there is probably not going to be the best idea for that. I've seen also a lot of times with our Epic analysts here, and we use Epic, and I'm going to say that throughout this, but whatever software you use, whether it be Cerner, Allscripts, whatever it is, oftentimes what will happen too, right, is the model's built, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, there's updates to it, and no one is continuing to take a look at the clinical decision support to see how it's functioning and what it's doing. In effect, what we do is everyone gets really excited because we've built a model and we've implemented it, and no one does that critical step of following up to see how it actually works in clinical practice and what kind of tweaks make sense to to say, hey, it looks like it's doing well for this particular encounter, but no one's evaluating those times when providers don't like to kind of see it there. So off the top of my head, I think those are some of the, the common mistakes that I see. I will also add that usually, at least what I hear from our information team, is that usually what's going to happen is everyone wants to have some kind of clinical decision support tool built as the number one request they get. And the second most common request they get is to take it down because it drives people crazy. And again, it goes back to, for any tool that we use in medicine or honestly in life, if we're not finding that value added in what we're doing, we've got to ask ourselves, why are we doing it and how can we make it better?
How can AI help us solve some of those issues with using clinical decision tools inside of the EMR?
If you look within the broad world of artificial intelligence, right, really what we're taking advantage of right now is the vast amount of data available in the electronic health record. And all institutions have varying amount of data that they can basically pull in at any point. But by taking advantage of larger data sets and more sophisticated approaches to build some kind of model, you can imagine it's very intuitive, right? If you're allowed to have 4 input features into a model, it'll probably do okay. It might not do great, right? But let's say now you're able to have 100. That additional data that you're getting from those input features, in most situations, not all, but in the vast majority, allows for better predictions. And how does that translate to improved clinical decision support? Well, that model that's put into play, right, that used to drive someone nuts because they said, yikes, this thing is wrong almost all the time when it tells me to worry that this person is at risk of, let's say, requiring an ICU bed or developing sepsis or some kind of adverse event suddenly becomes much more powerful as the model itself using artificial intelligence through any different mechanisms is now able to actually do that intended task. So it's in effect taking advantage of newer mathematical approaches, but also the large amount of data that electronic health records provide us with to better inform care for our patients.
Yeah, I love that idea of being able to use hundreds or thousands of variables instead of just the 2 or 4 that we derived that are the most high yield, but may not apply across the board to all of our patients. Gabe, you're here with us today because you have some experience in the realm of using AI for clinical decision assistance. Can you tell us a little bit about your project?
So starting in about 2017 or so, I took over our hospital sepsis committee. And at that point, a large focus of what we were trying to do was to improve our SEP1 quality metric numbers. And I imagine there are many emergency physicians throughout the country that when hear this quality metric tend to get very, very frustrated with it and have all kinds of concerns. And I'm very, very well aware of all of those. But around the time that I took this over, our now CMO said, hey, you know what? We're bringing over a new guy. He's a data scientist, and a lot of his work is in the early prediction of sepsis. It might make sense that you get linked up with him to kind of see what you two can do to kind of help us with our sepsis outcomes. And that was kind of the introduction that I had. And the idea, I think that going back, right, what's the value added by having some kind of clinical decision support for this is, I think in emergency medicine, we do very, very well when a patient is overtly septic. These are the ones that come in febrile, tachycardic, hypotensive, right? It doesn't take much to recognize that this person is septic, and we all know what to do in those situations. Where I think we tend to struggle with, though, is if there's a lot of diagnostic uncertainty originally. When the patient first gets triaged, could this be sepsis? Could this be pancreatitis? Could this be some kind of substance intoxication? Could this be heart failure? And what happens in those situations, right, is we send off some diagnostic tests. And if your emergency department is anything like mine, where it's very busy, we don't always get to follow up on those tests as soon as they come back, or we get distracted by something else. And so that was a particular population of sepsis patients that we noted tended to have worse outcomes. Because, right, we start down one pathway, we might not catch that they're septic, antibiotics get significantly delayed, and what happens? boom, they start to decompensate. They end up in your ICU 24 hours later. And we said, hey, what could we do to catch these patients earlier? And so that's what kind of brought together this partnership that started in 2018 about how could we use some newer technologies with a focus on machine learning to identify patients with sepsis in the emergency department and to actually bring that to the bedside. And this, of course, right, this was not something that happened overnight. In 2018, this was still something that was a little, right, where it was like, yikes, how are you going to actually do this? How are you going to build these models? What does that look like? What does the actual implementation look like? Oh my gosh, what are you going to do with false positives that are going to drive everyone in the emergency department crazy? Are you going to get support from this? Is there going to be money to do this? So initially when we started looking at this, it was like, yikes. This is a really, really intimidating thing to kind of, build something from scratch. So fortunately, I was, again, we had the particular good luck of having a very supportive C-suite here that thought this was something worth investing in. And the partnership I built with Dr. Shamim Namadi, I call it my partner in crime. We've been, working together probably every day for the past 6 years. We initially had some good luck putting some grants together, starting to, to build some momentum. And a lot of it first was, kind of how do we actually build a model that's going to be clinically useful? And you hear about all these fantastic things that people are doing now in the artificial intelligence world. They build a model that does this better than anyone else. They do something that's absolutely fantastic. But on the flip side, if you look at what's actually being used at the bedside, none of that stuff usually gets there. A lot of times, right, we talk about this chasm between what's reported to be out there and what's actually being done. And so we wanted to kind of bridge that gap. And so how did we do that? Well, a lot of what I started learning had to do with implementation science, right? How do you basically take something? At that point, we were still determining the evidence basis for what we were doing. And how do you effectively bring that to the bedside to make sure that the end users are satisfied? So a lot of the early steps, right, we're kind of reaching out, kind of finding who the best person to kind of send some kind of notification that this person is at risk of sepsis. Who is the best person to actually notify about that? What should the alert itself look like? And how would that impact the providers, the doctors and the nurses, their workflow within the emergency department? And that took a while to kind of figure out, right? Because if I imagine the physicians you work with, much like the ones I work with, right? They see a sepsis alert and they're like, yikes, I have PTSD of, Sears criteria being used to trigger something, right? Get this away from me as quickly as I can. And so after working through and, kind of involving, our departmental leadership, C-suite leadership, nursing leadership, what we felt would probably be the best way would actually to have our best practice advisory focus on our nurses getting the best practice advisory and to have them kind of adjudicate what was going on. If they thought sepsis was possible, to notify the physicians immediately. If they thought that it was some kind of error or something that didn't make sense, to basically stop it right there. And we chose the nurses for a few reasons. One was a practical side, is that a lot of times for a best practice advisory to pop up, so to speak, you actually have to be in the patient's chart. And let's say, again, you're working that busy shift in the emergency department. Your name is on 15, 16, 17 patients, right? What are the odds that that chart is going to be open when the alert fires?
Oh, that's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a very practical one, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? Best alert in the world. If it's not getting there when someone needs it, it can be quite challenging for it to actually have an impact. The next thing that we had to make sure was once the model was built, what we needed to do is find a way that we could ingest the data from our electronic health record and then send it up to the cloud to have the analysis done and to bring it back down in a secure fashion. And that's something, right, that not a lot of places had in 2018 and still a lot of places don't have right now, because that takes a lot of infrastructure and a lot of kind of moving parts to kind of add up, because a lot of times information security is very, very uptight about kind of the data that leaves your electronic health record, and to make sure that it's done in a way that HIPAA is not going to be violated. So we worked on that for a little bit, right, to make sure, hey, everything is being done in the right way. And that probably fell into place in about 2020 or so. And then we're like, yikes, what do we do now? We've got all the components necessary. And around that point, I remember I was actually working in the ICU, and I got a phone call from our CMO. He goes, Gabe, you guys have been talking about bringing this, this predictive model to the bedside for years now. And I don't see anything right now. And I have to give a talk on, basically how we're using this to save lives at UCSD. So it kind of gave us at that point that extra nudge, so to speak. So we started doing a lot of education, right? Again, we felt that we had all these good building blocks that were in place. We had a target audience, right? Get to our nurses, work with the physicians to make sure they take it seriously. The infrastructure was there. The model was there. So, we started moving forward, going live, and it was this big moment of, oh, yikes. Is this actually something that's going to work after, 3-4 years of a lot of effort going into it, or is it going to be a tremendous flop? And so what we made sure to do also is, of course, we wanted to study this. Is there value added, right? That's a common theme with this clinical decision support. So we went live at the end of 2022, and then we ran some analyses looking at before and after how our sepsis patients were doing in terms of mortality, in terms of bundle compliance, to see how they were actually looking. And what we were able to show was that we saw about a 17% relative decrease in mortality after the model went live, which was about a 2%, right? Which is pretty significant. And that in terms of the mechanism about why this might actually work, we saw that when the clinical decision support tool was there, that patients with suspected sepsis that were not initially treated were more likely to get antibiotics in a much more prompt fashion, and they were also much more likely to have our sepsis bundle completed. And so that we were really excited about that because, again, right, there's not many instances with prospective validation of these cool models that everyone keeps talking about actually being used in the clinical arena and how they're actually improving patient-centered outcomes. So we got really, really excited about that. And we've continued to really kind of work with this, right? To focus on things like how can we make this model more useful, right? Well, one of the things we noted was even sometimes the best model for predicting sepsis, the positive predictive value, no more than usually, 30, 35%, which still means, right, that if this model fires, that means 2 out of the 3 times, it's probably not going to be sepsis. And then suddenly, right, that can, distract people. So we've been taking advantage of some of the newer technologies out there, in particular, large language models. And what we actually do right now is as soon as there's any documentation in the electronic health record, we actually ingest the notes that are there, whether it be the triage note, the emergency medicine provider note. We ingest those notes, and then we use it to kind of filter out cases where it could be a false positive. Just to give you an example, a lot of times what we've seen with our model here is that things like GI bleeds, heart failure, methamphetamine intoxication tend to look a lot like sepsis. Patients are usually tachycardic. They've got some kind of abnormality with their labs. Usually their lactate is a little bit elevated, right? And that looks like a lot like sepsis. But by ingesting those clinical notes there, we're very easily to pass off to the model that, hey, it says this person is bleeding significantly. The chance of sepsis is going to be a lot less. So rather than sending that alert that goes off to the provider, we can stop that. And so people don't lose trust in the clinical decision support tool that we use.
That's the cool learning part of it.
That's the cool part, right? And again, these are some of the, I feel very fortunate that some of this stuff is, pretty cutting edge. But I think as we go forward in the next few years, a lot of these technologies are really going to kind of shoot off, particularly as, the larger electronic health records start to incorporate that into clinical use.
Yeah, and I think that's my next question, Gabe, is this all sounds fantastic. Why aren't we doing this right now? What are some of the challenges to implementation beyond UCSD with a supportive C-suite?
There's different reasons why certain hospitals haven't implemented this. I think one has to do, again, with that infrastructure, right, to kind of abstract the data out, get it up to some kind of service that basically runs the analysis on this and gets it back there. There are some older models, and again, we use Epic. I assume at UC Davis, you also use Epic, that also do perform some of these things within the Epic build itself. Probably one of the more famous ones is the Epic Sepsis Score that I don't know if you guys use. That one got a lot of negative press after it was sent all over the country and wasn't properly externally validated. So for some of these homegrown ones, right, it's the infrastructure. And again, that's something that I think is getting cheaper and cheaper. People are getting more and more comfortable with using things like Amazon Web Services, with actually having these connections that can actually get data from point A to point B in a secure fashion and then bring it back down in something that's also economically viable. So I think that's part of it right there. The infrastructure needs to be there. I think also part of it, right, is, seeing some success stories. No one wants to invest in something where they haven't seen that much as positive, even if there's a lot of excitement about it. That's our hope, right, is to give an example of something, right? Hey, we're able to do this. It took some work, but at least, with that right approach, that we're able to improve patient-centered outcomes. I think part of it too that, we haven't run the analysis on, but it does come down to that economic benefit. And I've spoken with a number of venture capitalists about this, and they're like, this is really cool stuff, but where's the money? Is it saving you money? And I think once more and more health systems see that, hey, there can be some significant, not only patient-centered outcome improvement, but also will save money through earlier detection of things, through better informed treatment, that I think that's really going to kind of, push a lot of healthcare systems to embrace this as we move forward.
Is your health system okay with the cost of developing and maintaining a robust system like you have developed? Or what does that look like in the future?
When we started, a lot of this was built off grant funds. And I realized there's not many places that can say, hey, that's great. But you know what? We don't have people that are giving us money to do this. We did have discussions with kind of our hospital leadership saying, hey, we're able to give you a tangible benefit with this, right? And obviously we can't keep grant funds tied up now that we've demonstrated the need here. And, at least at our institution, they made the decision to continue supporting this by covering a lot of the informatics costs, right? What does it take to get something to Amazon Web Services? What does it take to store some of the data there? What does it take to come back? And I don't think it's anything that was particularly overpowering, so to speak, that it's like, oh my gosh, this is a few $1 million a year. But it is something I think that, goes back, right? What's the value added there? And I think, again, right tool, right place for what the hospital needs for an area of opportunity, you can really make a huge difference. And again, I think that's where the cost savings come in. Like most things, right? You have to put a little bit in to get something out with a technology like this.
Okay, those are some of the financial costs. Gabe, do you have a few stories that you can share with us about how your staff handled this implementation? What were some of the challenges from your frontline team, your RNs, your doctors, your techs, whoever?
We did a pretty in-depth survey, actually, of our doctors, our nurses, our APPs to see how they felt about this. And in general, some of the themes that we saw, and I'll jump into some specifics, were that people that are younger and closer to their terminal degree we're more excited about using AI in medicine, right? So the residents, the younger attendings, the younger nurses thought this was really cool. And a lot of them like, wow, this is something, right, that, I'm actually proud of using, right, that we're kind of pushing forward with this. I'm going to contrast that, though, with some of the attendings that I remember were already senior when I was a resident. And they told me on day one, they said, this stuff is really cool, Gabe, but you know what? It's not for me. I'm not going to use this. I just don't buy it. And I think that's a real segment of the population. It's not wrong to be skeptical of this technology when it comes out, right? There's a lot of promises that are being made. And for every success story in this, people can always pull up another story of something that's a very, very big, how we can call this, a learning opportunity with what goes on. So it was that constant discussions with them, at least, hey, this is what we're trying to do. This is why we're doing it. We're not asking you to drop everything and change what you're doing, but at least be open to the idea. Now, did that work? There's two people in particular that still to this day laugh at me. At least we have an understanding that that's just their perspective, right? They feel that they don't need to use this kind of clinical decision support, even though I've provided them some examples of patients where they could have probably been a little bit, earlier on their antibiotics, cultures, lactate, and stuff like that. But it is very interesting, again, who adopts this technology and who doesn't. But I think at least moving forward, right, as more and more people start to kind of see some of the power of what can be done with some of this artificial intelligence driving clinical decision support, that I think we'll get more and more buy-in from people.
Gabe, I have heard about software as a medical device. You have to have the FDA approval for medical devices. Do you have to have FDA approval for AI creating these types of tools, or how does that governance work?
You are asking a very, very complicated question to which I don't think that there is a definitive answer at this point. And just to define that for everyone listening, because I think that's part of the challenge with this, is software that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So some kind of AI clinical decision support certainly does fall within that domain. And if you take it a little bit further, it really kind of falls in, what are you meaning when you say what's a medical device? The FDA provides some guidance on this, and usually for any of these software tools, usually when it falls under that software as medical device has to do when it's either diagnosing some kind of condition or recommending some kind of treatment strategy for it. And if it falls within that domain, let's say that I've built this here and I want to sell it to someone else. That's where a lot of these rules about, did you go through FDA approval for this? Now, what we did at UCSD, right, we built this as a quality improvement project. So does that fall under software as a medical device? At UCSD, it doesn't yet. But if we were to go out, right, and start selling this, let's say UC Davis got very interested in this, then we would have to go through that. But it's also even more complicated because if you think about a lot of the large electronic health record vendors right now, they have their own machine learning models and AI models that are embedded within their own electronic health records that you can access. And this is where I've yet to kind of find a strong reason on why they don't have to go through the same approval process. A lot of it has to do with the intended use. Once you start to say this is used to diagnose or guide therapeutics is when you fall within that software as a medical device, which I have friends that are going through this right now. It's a very, very painful process of demonstrating the utility. If you apply for software as a medical device, and there's been about 700 or so different AI applications that have done this, going through, you don't have to demonstrate benefit to patients. You just have to demonstrate that there's some kind of safety component with it. So you don't have to go through and say, hey, if you use this, you'll see an improvement in patient-centered outcomes, but rather that there's no harm that's being done from it. So it's a very interesting threshold right now. And I think the FDA right now is trying to kind of figure out the ideal strategy for these AI models that are now being used as clinical decision support. And I think what we'll see is in the next 3-4 years, hopefully some kind of clarity on how these are done, because right now it is all over the place.
So, Gabe, you've already published about this fantastic body of work that you've done as a quality improvement project, quality assurance project at UCSD. Why not make it open access and pass it along to us at UC Davis? Is it because of this FDA process? Even if it's free, do you still have to go through that? Or why not just make it open access?
That's a very loaded question with, there's like most things, right? There's multiple reasons. One of them to be upfront, right, is this did take a lot of time. And, some of my co-investigators that have been driving this for quite some time, I don't know how they'd feel about, something, right, as engineers, right, that they've developed over 6 or 7 years just with handing this off without some kind of reimbursement for it. And this is a very common thing, right? If you build a cool technology, right, should you get some kind of compensation if someone else in a surrounding institution uses it? So I think that's one thing that has to be addressed, right? Is, what's the ideal way to kind of share this? There is the regulatory side too, right? About, how would something like that get regulated, right? Can we just post this out there and let people use it? But there's also some concerns when it comes to the use of a model that's been largely developed at one institution. How does it translate someplace else, right? And this, again, not to harp too much on sepsis, but this was the classic pitfall that happened with the EPIC sepsis score. Built, externally validated within a few places, and then sent all over the country. And what did we see is that the performance that was promised really fell short. And in particular, there's a very famous report from the University of Michigan that showed that the performance metrics really were significantly lower than what was promised. No one really got any value added there. And so that's something that, we've tinkered with. We've had some publications in Annals of Emergency Medicine talking about strategies to kind of mitigate that. But until a model is fine-tuned for the patients you're taking care of, at your own institution, right, it becomes somewhat problematic to take what someone else is using and just throw it there without a good implementation strategy, including to make sure that the model actually works there. Taking a model that doesn't work well for your patients doesn't add value. Everyone wants it turned off.
And I think that leads to this next thought of how do we mitigate or address potential biases inside of AI algorithms, especially when treating diverse populations. Now, obviously, the machines are not biased. It's those that are creating it or the databases that it is fed that lead to those biases. But how do we make sure that they are equitable algorithms?
That's a fantastic question. And I think, I'll put this in the background. There's a very famous paper that was published in Science in 2019 that really got people very interested in this topic, where clinical decision support was used to kind of allocate funds to people. And what a group of researchers found is that if you were Black, the model would say you needed less money than white people, even though everything else was equivalent. And everyone's alarm bells, of course, you hear that. That's totally inequitable, right? That's a travesty that is something that a model is suggesting, right, with the data that's there. Within that background, there's a few ways that I think about this. The first is, kind of looking at the different stages of bringing clinical decision support to the bedside. The first one is the question you're asking an equitable one, right? Does everyone equally benefit from this, or does it target a select population over others? The next has to do with the actual model development itself. And that's where I think a lot of these questions, right, is the data that we're using to build our clinical decision support representative of patients all over, not just a particular demographic group, which historically has usually been, the middle-aged white males that go to a VA or something along those lines. And then the final one has to do with the implementation of the model and how the end user actually responds to the clinical decision support with their own biases that go there. So with that being said, I think there's a few things that we'd all agree need to happen. The first is any kind of model that's developed should have a positive impact and an equal impact for all patient populations. I think that's a fundamental given with what we're looking at. The next thing kind of when it comes to the AI side or the machine learning side is making sure that we minimize specific types of biases here. Probably the big one is going to be selection bias of the data, which basically means that if we're choosing that non-representative patient population for what we're trying to do, and we're trying to translate that to other groups, we find the model might not work as well. So I think that's a really, really big one in terms of making sure that the model that's used for clinical decision support is a just one. We also want to make sure that key variables are not being excluded. And this is something called exclusion or reporting bias, where we're effectively leaving out something that could be very, very important in terms of an input feature for a model. And then the final one that I've always been very intrigued by as a clinician has to do with something that's referred to as automation bias. What that refers to is when the human that's actually interacting with the clinical decision support tends to trust the model more than they should, and they don't think critically about what's going on there. I've seen this time and time again, and you probably have too, right? When the BPA goes up for someone, there's always going to be that one or two people that believe it at face value, particularly trainees, right? And they learn a little bit more to kind of take a step back. But biases are something that we have to be very, very careful about when it comes to all stages of development of a model.
In summary, garbage in, garbage out, and engage brain. Is that fair?
I think that's a very fair way. Yes, that's a much more concise way of saying what I just said. Yes.
Gabe, where does consent fit into all of this? Did you have to go to each patient that you were using this AI-generated clinical decision support tool on and say like, hey, we're engaging AI in your clinical care today? Or how did that fit in?
When we were building this, right, we went through the appropriate IRB at UCSD for data abstraction. We have a quality improvement cohort too, right, to kind of go through and, explain what we were doing, why we were doing it. In terms of the actual implementation, right, did we approach patients and say, hey, AI is being used in your care? We did not use that. And I don't think there's a strong precedent at this point about doing that. And if you think about the history of clinical decision support, how many best practice advisories do you actually go to the patient and say, hey, is it okay if we see if your thyroid test has been checked in the past? I think from a broad ethical standpoint, it's infeasible to ask everyone that comes through an emergency department, right? Do you consent to your data to be used to improve patient care? The goal of our hospital, right, is to become a learning, highly reliable institution. We learn from patients' data that comes in. We don't tag these patients and save their names or anything like that. Everything becomes de-identified. And again, the goal is to kind of use their data to improve care for everyone. So getting consent, I think, becomes almost impossible. For something like this, where it's a strong basis in quality improvement, I think it makes sense to go ahead without getting everyone's consent, because that would just, again, it would slow the entire process down to the point of bringing it to a halt.
Yeah. Gabe, what can the average emergency medicine physician do with what they learned from you today?
Asking questions, right? What is artificial intelligence? How can it be used in clinical decision support? I think that helps dispel a lot of the, kind of the misconceptions that are out there. I remember very vividly one of our residents, when I first told him that we were doing this, he literally told me he thought that meant that a Terminator-style individual was walking around the hospital wards asking people to check lactates. And I explained to him that's not really what we're going through, right? So one is obviously asking questions, right? What is this? How can this be used at my institution? Is there a role at this point? What do we need to kind of add in terms of helping clinical care? If you are interested, there's a number of great resources, a lot of great journals that are out there that can also provide valuable perspective, as well as use case scenarios that a lot of times can fit within the emergency department world. So there's some great journals out there. Just off the top of my head, there's NEJM AI, New England Journal of Medicine AI, just started. That's got a lot of fantastic use case scenarios. There's also Nature Digital Medicine, has a lot of these wonderful examples of what can be done. And then I think a lot of it too, right, is it's just going back and, seeing what we've published in our own emergency medicine journals currently about what's out there. Now, there's not a lot, and it's something I think we could probably focus on. The large professional societies could probably emphasize a little bit more. Pushing professional societies to take a look at this is something that I think would add a lot of benefit towards pushing emergency medicine doctors to the forefront if there's interest there.
What do you see as the future of AI in clinical decision support? Like, what do you think we should learn from that piece of it?
Yeah, in terms of the future, right? It goes back to a lot of the core objectives of what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve patient care in an efficient manner and also make sure, right, that we're ensuring the continuity and minimizing burnout with emergency medicine physicians. So how can we do that using clinical decision support? Helping in those areas, right, where there might be some kind of diagnostic uncertainty for appropriate diagnoses in a timely fashion. Also making sure that we are minimizing any kind of charting burden when it comes to emergency medicine physicians, I think is a wonderful way, right, to use some kind of AI model, right? Hey, you can decrease how much needs to be written or something like that, or something that can minimize the amount of time that's spent charting. And then also to make sure, right, that things happen in an efficient manner. So again, we can go back to why we went into emergency medicine in the first place. Timely, rapid diagnosis of serious pathology to make sure our patients get the best possible outcomes. And again, I think that the future moving forward, right, it's a symbiosis of, some of these AI tools through clinical decision support that can then allow us to get back to what we enjoy doing rather than kind of slogging through all kinds of frustrations that pop up with an inefficient system that we have right now.
What are you most excited to watch for regarding AI in emergency medicine?
I think there's a few things here. So first, some of the personal interests I have are, what I'll call multimodal data, which is bringing in data from different sources to help with whatever task you're trying to do. So I mentioned earlier, right, one of the things we brought into our sepsis prediction model was clinical notes, running it through a large language model to refine effectively the model's differential diagnosis. But there's also a ton of space, I think, for wearable biopatches and things like that work both in the emergency department, but sending someone home with a wearable biopatch rather than keeping them in the hospital with some kind of way of kind of seeing, does it look like they're going in the right direction? Or, hey, you need to come back now, I think is something that's really, really exciting. And I think honestly, from my side too, I'd love to see, a lot of emergency medicine physicians kind of push forward with some of the AI applications in clinical medicine. I still think this is a very young field. And besides the health informaticists that I think have jumped on this from a very broad background, it would be fantastic to see emergency medicine physicians kind of pushing forward just because we see so many different kind of patient populations here. I think there's a tremendous, area of opportunity and growth for us to pursue this.
Yeah, we need that clinical presence in this new era to make sure that this is informed by clinical practice. Okay, so that is a lot about AI, but we are not done. We have one more topic to swim through before we are done with AI: regulation and governance. Okay, I know it's not the sexiest of topics, but wait, before you turn us off, I will tell you this is probably the most crucial of all of the AI topics because it sets the bar for how we integrate AI into emergency medicine and if we can trust AI. So join us next time as we learn how we can safely integrate AI into our hospitals. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and stay tuned.